that emerged was food. They talked about the monthly soup and sandwich lunch after the Sunday morning service. They talked about older people in the church who gave them snacks. And they talked about going round to other people's houses for something to eat. Now, I've done a wee bit of studying at New College. I'm not finished yet, so I wouldn't pretend to know everything. But according to the likes of Calvin or John Knox, eating together isn't one of the traditional marks of the church. And in my studies at New College so far, but we haven't come across the cooking or the hospitality module. But when I was listening to the young people speaking on Sunday, I was reminded that actually eating together was a feature of church life right from the beginning. Way from the beginning, that actually before they did most other things, they were eating together. And at the end of Acts chapter 2, we read of a church that meets for teaching, for fellowship, for worship, for prayer. We read of a group that shared their possessions. And then in Acts chapter 2, verses 46, we read this. Day after day, they met as a group in the temple, and they had their meals together in their homes, eating with glad and humble hearts, praising God and enjoying the goodwill of all the people. And every day, the Lord added to their group those who were being saved. To me, it turns out that the element of church today that actually matters most to my children and our young people in our church was a core feature of the church right from the start. And as we consider some of the culture changes that we might need to make in our own churches, we've got to remember we've got an amazing resource, a stream of tradition that takes us way back through the ages where we can find wisdom and guidance in the Bible, and that forms the foundation of whatever we're going to do. And however, though, as with every generation before us, we need to find ways that we can take that wisdom, the guidance from the Word of God, interpret it, and apply it to the situation that we find ourselves in. And that's what we're doing tonight as we embark on this initiative together with Growing Young. And it's one of the things that excites me the most, that we're underpinning this great learning that we have from Growing Young with the foundation that we find in the Word of God. And we could use the insights that we have from what's happening in other churches and in our culture today to help us then try and recapture something of what that early church had. The outcome of what that early church was doing was that every day the Lord added to their group those who were being saved. And that's got to be our prayer for the church today. So let's pray. Lord God, as your Spirit infused and inspired that church in Jerusalem, we ask that the same Spirit will infuse and inspire us today. We seek your wisdom and your guidance. Show us the way that we should go. We ask for your energy, your courage to help us do what needs to be done. And our prayer today, Lord Jesus, is that every day you will add to the church in Scotland those who are being saved. In the name of Jesus, amen.
Amen. Thank you, Doug. Was it Doug or Douglas? Your name says Douglas, so I don't want to offend you by calling you Doug. Okay, great. Thank you for sharing and getting us started. My name is Jake Mulder. I'm part of the Fuller Youth Institute team. I'll introduce myself briefly and then let Brad introduce himself. I can't think of a better way to start than with Acts chapter 2. You in Scotland have a lot more history than some of our churches in the United States, so I thought you might appeal to something from a few hundred years ago, but you're going back 2,000 years, which aligns very well with our research. When we spent time with a lot of teenagers and young adults asking about the church that they hoped and dreamed for, they often didn't point to something that was all that different or utilizing the latest social media or technology. It was a church that in many ways modeled the ancient church and the best aspects of the ancient church as we know it. So my name is Jake Mulder. I'm co-author of Growing Young. I work for Fuller. I have 2 kids, ages 5 and 2, which keep me caring a whole lot about the future of the church. My wife and I are trying to raise them in lockdown here. also involved in my own church, but you'll get to hear from me more in a moment. So Brad, you want to tell us just a little bit about you?
Yeah, sure. Brad, also one of the senior leaders at Fuller Youth Institute, and serve as a minister in my local church working with youth and families, and also raising 3 kids. 2 of them are teenagers and a preteen. We have one who's hoping to head to university this fall. So yeah, we'll see what all that looks like. But we're in the thick of it every day. So that drives not only my interest and curiosity as a researcher and leader and trainer, but also just my passion as a parent and my need to understand young people, I think, grows every day.
Yeah.
It's great to be with you.
Very good to be with you. What we're going to do on this webinar is we connected with some of you several months ago, and we gave you kind of the overview of what Growing Young is about. We're going to very briefly give you the overview of what Growing Young is about, but quickly for those of you who have already heard it. But then we want to recognize that we're in a very different place in our churches than we perhaps anticipated 3 or 4 months ago. So as we look ahead to this Growing Young cohort that's going to kick off, we really want to think about what can we do in the next few months that's going to help us prepare for next steps, that's going to help us prepare for the future. Before I do that, I want to give you a few Zoom details, the first of which is in just a moment, we're going to ask you to chat in a response. So depending on if you're on a computer or a tablet or iPad, it'll either be at the bottom or top of your screen. There should be a little button that says chat. Would invite you to open that. We'll give you the question in just a moment here, but the other piece is you can change your view. Hopefully you figured that out on Zoom. Generally, we ask that you keep yourself muted unless you're speaking, and we will be sending you into breakout rooms in just a little bit. But otherwise, feel free to utilize the chat at any point that you have a question, and we will try to address those. So here's the first question that we want to ask you to chat in, and I believe Brad's going to chat this in while I cover it verbally. On a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being completely stable and 1 being unstable, how does your ministry or how does your church feel right now? So 10 is everything is fine, it's never been better, stable. 1 is things are completely up in the air. We would love to know, how do things feel in your church? All right, so we've got some responses coming in, and these are flying through. If you can keep up with these, we started with a 7, a 5, an 8, a 7, a 5, some 3s, 6s, 8s, 7s, 6, 4. Now Brad and I are researchers. We're not necessarily math whizzes, but I'm going to say the average here is somewhere around like a 6. I'm seeing a lot of 8s. I'm seeing a handful of 4s and 3s, but the read I'm getting right now is like kind of stable, but not completely. I don't know, somewhere in there. Brad, any comments on the average number you're seeing fly through here?
Yeah, I'm saying probably about 7. Yeah,
okay.
That's interesting.
So that's helpful. Now, I want to nuance the question slightly. Here's the new question, which again, Brad will chat in for us. On a scale of 1 to 10, how does life feel for those in your church right now? So not for the church, but your members, your parishioners, those who, the congregation. How would those within your church answer that same question? All right, we've got some responses coming in. And interesting, I am already feeling like these responses are a little bit lower. Maybe not completely.
Slightly lower, yeah.
Slightly lower. It's feeling like maybe a 5-ish average. I'll say this, I feel like we're seeing a lot more range on how life is going for the average person within our congregation as opposed to our church. Now, Graham, you're laughing. Do you have any comments on why that might be? Why the difference?
No, I'm only laughing because somebody's put 6.25.
Someone is very precise. Tony, we might involve you in our analysis team later. part of the reason I asked this question, and Brad has chatted in, if those of you who chatted at 2 or 3, we'd love for you to share a little bit more in the chat about why. Part of the reason we asked this is this whole process of growing young. Douglas started us out by saying this is about culture change, and this whole conversation is about how we recalibrate to the world that we find around us. And for those of you who have said, oh, that whole growing young cohort, that sounded interesting when everything was normal, but now that everything is up in the air, I wonder if growing young is still relevant. We think this whole conversation about how we shift and adapt our church's culture is just as relevant in the midst of a pandemic. It is just as relevant in the midst of social or cultural or political change, because it's about really who are we at our core? What does our culture look like? So to get into that, if you haven't been exposed to Growing Young yet, we want to briefly cover the highlights of what Growing Young is about. So Brad, are you ready to do that if I share my screen?
Yeah, sounds good.
All right, here we go.
So we're assuming that you've heard of Growing Young before, or you wouldn't be here today, but we do want to make sure we're kind of starting on the same page. And in particular, just to go back to the beginning, that this came about because of a lot of bad news about the church. And in the US, and Graham and Neela in particular have been quick to remind us that in your context, you've been ahead of this question for a while and ahead of this concern. But in the US, really just the last couple of decades, this concern over the aging and shrinking of the church began to be more and more of a just reality. And as we work with churches, at one point we worked primarily with youth ministry leaders. And over time, we began to work with more and more pastors, senior ministers, and kind of overall church leaders, because our youth ministry leaders said, hey, we can't really do much change in the church on our own without more leadership involved. And so that actually pushed us back into research and to try to understand, well, what's going on in churches and what does that look like systemically? Because we began to wonder, well, what if the bad news about the church isn't the only news about the church? What if that's not the whole story? And we often at FYI, we are a research and training organization. And on the research side, we want to take a hopeful angle. We believe that Growing Young is primarily about hope. It's about possibility. It's that whatever the state of your church right now, God has big dreams for the church. God has hopes for the future, and that future is about the church thriving. And in order for any church to thrive, we want all generations. God hopes for all generations to be part of that thriving. And for a lot of churches, who's really absent are young people. And young people in their teens and in their 20s in particular. And so that's really where we zeroed in on our research. Our primary research question on this next slide is we wanted to know, what are the churches that aren't shrinking and aging, but are growing, specifically in involving and retaining young people ages 15 to 29 as the demographic that's most absent from the church. But with this overall goal that brings overall vitality to the whole church, because that's a fundamental assumption of ours. So out of that research, with over 250 churches, that was a US-based, North America-based study, we found what we call 6 core commitments. These core commitments that we felt like hold together in these churches that we studied, that tended to be this mix that was kind of a secret sauce, so to speak, of how churches engage young people well. And here I want to point you to the handout, and in particular on page 2 of your handout, you'll see this wheel and a description of the wheel. We talk about these core commitments sort of holding together in this process. And to just kind of run through these briefly, and you'll have the descriptions there that you can refer to. keychain leadership, or unlocking keychain leadership, is really about the way that we give authority and power away, in particular to young people. Empathy, or empathizing with young people today, is taking us beyond judgment and helping us step into the shoes of another generation as a way to understand them and a way to really be able to build the kind of church that we're hoping to build. Taking Jesus' message seriously, you already take Jesus' message seriously, but in this core commitment, we found that churches are taking that a step deeper, really understanding, how do today's young people understand the gospel, and how might our language or approach to sharing the gospel might need to change. Fueling a warm community, these warm relationships. This is good news for churches who gave up being cool a long time ago. that most people, and young people in particular, are looking for warmth. They're looking for connection in the church. Like we just heard about food, missing food. That's about warmth. And then prioritizing young people everywhere and their families. That we can't just say, oh, young people are the future of the church, but that we prioritize them everywhere across the life of the church today, right now. And then finally, being the best neighbors. That we cannot exist in our world today without speaking to the needs and concerns of the world and being the neighbors that the world needs. As we look at this a little closer in this next slide, we see that Jesus-centered community is really at the heart of this. That we're not just relegating Jesus to one of the core commitments, that we found a central commitment to being communities, churches that are centered around the person and work of Jesus and the ongoing work of the Holy Spirit today. And beyond that all of this lives in context. That just like the churches we studied, were embedded in particular contexts in their communities, with their traditions, with their specific people, that your church, your congregation lives in a specific context. And that context has a lot to say about how you apply the 6 core commitments, how you live them out, how you figure out what it means to lead your church forward into this next season. And so a lot of this cohort is going to be about context and helping you contextualize into your own environment, your own church. And finally, I'll just want to point out that this core commitment of prioritizing, there's a little arrow off to the side of prioritizing everywhere. That we find that some churches, they can share leadership and show empathy and focus on Jesus and be warm, but if they don't prioritize young people, that cycle can continue and that church can really grow old and die out. That prioritizing will hammer over and over in this process as one of the keys to really moving towards the hope for the future that we want to build together. So we'll talk a lot about that, but I'm going to hand off to Jake now to talk about why thinking about culture, church culture, is so important.
Yeah, thanks, Brad. So you've all then gotten the base level, these 6 areas that we've said need to be part of your church's culture, that if you want to go back and read what Douglas read, Acts chapter 2, you're going to find that these themes carry all over in the early church. A warm sense of community, sharing food. It's all about Jesus and Jesus's message. Young people are empowered and take on leadership. But at this point, what we like to say is we think growing young is not primarily about changing youth ministry. It's about changing your church's culture. And for some of you who would say, well, we got into growing young, it's not that we need to grow a little younger. It's that we don't even have any young people in our church at all. We do think that this is a discussion for you because you need to figure out the first steps of how do we begin to shift our church's culture to actually have it be ready to form, disciple, and invest in younger people. One other quote that I want to add here comes from Scott Cormode, who's a professor at Fuller Seminary, works close with Todd Bolsinger, who I know some of you have heard from. Scott says this, that the church as we know it is calibrated for a world that doesn't exist. And we think that in many ways, the church pre-COVID-19 was calibrated for a world that doesn't exist. we think that in many ways, even more strongly, the church during COVID has been laid bare how distant we are from the world around us. So we want this cohort to very much be about a process of recalibrating. Now, we've given you an overview of what Growing Young is about. In just a second, I want to introduce you to a church leader who's been through this cohort before. Her name is Lisa. Before I do that, I have to say, someone messaged me privately and said, Data Nerd says the average of the first question was a 6.7 and the average of the second question was a 5.4. So again, first question was, how stable are things for your church? 6.7. Second question, how stable is it for the people in your church? A 5.4. So thank you, Data Nerd. We'll let you chat in if you want to identify yourself. But Lisa, you're here somewhere, I believe, right? Can you unmute yourself, Lisa?
Hello, everyone.
Hey, Lisa. So Lisa, thanks for being on. Now, to establish this first, you're not a paid actor from Hollywood, right? You're like a real church leader. Is that correct?
I am a real live church leader.
Okay,
yes.
Awesome. Lisa, can you tell us a little bit about your church, location, size, just a little background?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. So my name is Lisa. I work at a non-denominational independent church in the Silicon Valley in California. So I joke that I live in Google's backyard because I do. So Google, Apple, Facebook, all those, that's where I live and work and minister. And we are a 20-year-old church of about a couple hundred, founded to reach Gen X, complete with water cooler. And so we went through Growing Young. The first year they offered a cohort in 2016 and 17. And then I've also been a coach ever since. And so I've gotten to not only do this on the front lines with my church for the last 4 years. I've been in youth ministry for 11 years, on staff for 11 years, but now I've also gotten to see a lot of other churches go through it in the last 3 or 4 years.
And Lisa, I know enough about your church to know, so some of the narrative, you were founded by a couple of Gen X pastors. So people who I'm guessing are like in their late 40s, early 50s now. The church was founded primarily with young adults. So there were a lot of 20 somethings, et cetera. But really in a period of the last 20 years, your church has grown older because those who are originally in their 20s, they were the young people, are now the church of people who are in their 40s, 50s. And I believe you've expressed a sense of the church has actually struggled to figure out how do we become that church that incorporates young people again. Do I understand that accurately? Can you just say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so that's exactly right. So we branched off of a church in 2001, and it was a church that originally started as like a young adults weekend church service and then became a church. And so it was, founded by a Gen X and a boomer pastor. So now about 50 and in their 60s. But targeting the young adults at the time, which was Gen X. And then by the time Growing Young came around, I said, that's great, but they're all families in their 40s now. They're actually not the young people anymore. And if we have this heart and we have this history of caring for young people, of caring for young adults and the upcoming generation, but there's a whole new generation that we need to think about. And actually now we have Gen Z, it's not just millennials. Even millennials are getting old now. And so in a lot of ways, Growing Young was this opportunity to say, this is actually part of why we were founded. This is part of who we are. But that was 20 years ago. And it's time to kind of hit the refresh button on that. And we've become more intergenerational. I almost said denominational. So, it's not like Gen X is our oldest people. We have elders in their 80s. We've, merged with other campuses. So we have the full gamut of ages now. And so it's not only how do we reach young people today, but how do we reach all the generations that we now have? We can't just focus on one group.
That's great. And so your church is 20 years old. I'm guessing there may be some churches on here who are 200 years old, but I think the principle is similar. We were founded with a certain mentality, may need to recover some of that. Lisa, you knew that a new program wasn't going to fix this quickly. It had to be about a culture change. I'm curious, what are a couple of the areas you focused in as a church, and how did the cohort process help you take next steps?
Yeah, so we focused, as far as the commitments go that Brad and Jake just kind of ran through, we focused on keychain leadership and warm community. And with keychain leadership, we specifically were interested in how do we actually equip and train and empower our leaders. There's some great phrases in the book that talk about you can be keychain, which means you actually kind of train and pass on keys or responsibility. But then there's also key loaners who give them away and then take them back, or key hoarders who hold on to them. Or we talk about key chucking, where we kind of like throw the keys at people and then we get mad at them for dropping them. And so we were convicted that as a church, we were much more in those categories, that we gave keys away, but we would often take them back, or we would chuck them and not train people properly. And so we kind of honed in on that. And then warm community was actually, I think, a strength of our church. So you don't always have to go for your worst scores, but we thought, how can we go even deeper? How can we focus this on our young adults and our young people, not just, families who often become the default target, but how can we really make sure that we're warm for our 20-somethings, for our teenagers, for the young people in our community? And so that kind of bled into empathy and prioritization a little bit naturally. But we, in the cohort, to answer how that helped us, the cohort was really like a year of laying the foundation. And so I felt like that was kind of planting the seeds and really understanding what it means for these values to be contextualized to our church and our area and our values, but making this kind of our unified language and value system, that we share the same words and the same terminology for what we're trying to do in our church and what we're trying to do in our ministry. And it wasn't reinventing. Like I said, it was in some ways getting back to the heart of who we are. And well, we're only 20 years old. I've coached churches who are 150, and they find the same thing. They find great stories about their history, and they find those nuggets of, this is in our DNA. So how do we strengthen that and revitalize that and bring it into today's context and values? And so the cohort helped us flesh all that out, and it helped us lay the foundation and do the work of contextualizing, do the work of kind of getting buy-in and understanding across our staff and key leaders in the community, because it is culture change and that takes a long time. And so while we had small wins along the way, the cohort really helped us lay the groundwork for years of work, honestly.
Lisa, last bit quickly here. So you're in Silicon Valley. Can we assume this was just quick, easy? You all moved through this so fast. And along those lines, what bit of advice would you give to a group of churches who are about to start this Growing Young cohort journey?
Yeah. No, it was not quick and easy. While we do live in an area that loves innovation and changes and fast technology and all of that, the church is still an institution that moves slow, and culture changes slow. And I think church culture changes slowly, and that's true wherever you are. And that's true whether you're 5 years old or 100 years old. I've worked with brand new churches and I've worked with very old churches, and changing culture just takes time because it's pervasive. And so, no, it took a long time. It is taking a long time. In some ways, this work can be never ending, because areas that were strengths that can become weaknesses, and areas that were weak can become strong. And we really started talking about this in our church, about how this is not a program, this is not a fad, this is not just the latest research, even though it is research-based, but really, and Brad and Jake and the others will tell you this, they just confirmed what we've always known about church, right? In so many ways, this is about getting back to being a healthy church and who the church is meant to be. It's just helping contextualize how we talk about that. And so in some ways, this is never ending work. It's not like, oh, we did it, we've grown young, we're done now, because then you take this, that's what happened to my church, right? They grew young at their founding, and then 20 years later, those young people aren't young anymore. So I think we really started to see fruit like after the cohort, which is why I say it laid the foundation. We saw small victories along the way. We saw some buy-in along the way, but really the fruit that has been born was year 2, year 3. And now we're in year 4, and it's becoming part of who we are, but it always requires some attention.
Great. Lisa, thank you so much for joining us. And whatever is appropriate for a Scottish context, if you want to clap for Lisa, if you snap for Lisa, maybe you do something else. Yes, Neil, nice work with the clap hands. Lisa, thanks so much for giving us a taste of what this looks like. You all will likely get a chance to hear from Lisa in the upcoming year. She is someone who coaches for us, presents for us, and has been through this as a church leader. Brad has just put in the chat. We'd love to hear any questions you have along the way if you want to put them in the chat. The plan from here, Brad and I we wanted to give you kind of the sense of what Growing Young is and a taste of what it looks like. We're going to give you a little bit of advice on how you prepare for that journey. So next steps you can take, particularly as we're in or coming out of the pandemic. And then we're going to send you all to your groups for about 20 minutes to have some discussion on all of this. And then we'll come back together and have some more time for questions. Does that make sense to everybody? Can you give me a thumbs up if you're tracking with that? Okay, wonderful. Let me cover then the taking Growing Young and thinking about how we get ready, particularly in the midst of or after the pandemic. I am going to chat in an article here. You do not need to click on this now, but you are welcome to and bookmark it for later. This feels a little self-serving because this is an article that I wrote for the Fuller Youth Institute a few weeks ago called Leading Change When Everything Has Changed. And the rules for leading change are simple enough when we're in a period of stability. Things get more complicated when we're leading change in the midst of everything around us that has changed. Now, I share this as someone who cares about young people. I also share this as someone who's wrapping up my PhD in church leadership with a focus on congregational change. So I just want to bring you into this. And here's the first question that I want to chat in, invite you to chat in. What is one area that you found yourself innovating or learning during the pandemic these last few months? Okay, so I'd love for you to chat in. What is one way that you found yourself innovating or learning during the pandemic these last few months? And Diana, we will come back to your question a little bit later about how to start with if you have no young people. All right, so we've got video editing skills, virtual groups, live streaming worship, more video editing, online, Zoom, making phone calls to young people, right? Feel free to continue to chat in. But as these ideas are being chatted in and as you're reading what's coming in, the point that I want us to realize is many of us can operate with this mindset of, we've been in the pandemic, I can't wait till we get back to normal church because then we can start to rethink our approach, right? Many of us have had this like, wait until we get back to normal and then we'll start to figure out what we want the future to look like. The mindset shift that I want to invite us to consider is just like all of you are typing in right now, you have been in the midst of innovating, you have been in the midst of designing, you have been in the midst of rethinking what it means to actually be the church. The mindset shift that I'm talking about is viewing this time during the pandemic or as the pandemic's winding down, we will see what happens, as a season of openness and possibility, not just a season of gridlock or inability. I'll say that one more time, that this can be a season of openness and possibility, not just gridlock or inability. It's believing that this is actually a time for you to lead change because everything has just changed. Now, let me unpack why I say that. A lot of experts who study change agree that one of the most difficult aspects of bringing about change is getting people out of their mental rut that they're in, right? The regular habit, the thing that they normally do, getting people out of that rut and being open to change is one of the biggest barriers to actually leading change. Now, a way of saying that is that when you're trying to get someone to change, you could say their current mindset or their current behavior is frozen. So I know we're a little ways from winter, but think about winter, right? When everything gets cold. When something is frozen, it can be very difficult to move. It can be very difficult to change. So one of the things that we need to do when it comes to bringing change is we need to unfreeze people's behavior. We need to unfreeze people's mindset. That's normally incredibly difficult to do You can pray for them. You can try and initiate different things, but it's very difficult to bring about change. A faster or easier way to unfreeze people's behaviors or mindset can be a crisis, a significant event, something like COVID-19 that actually dislodges people's normal expectations. And what happens is when we're in a season of disruption and instability like COVID-19, when our habits, when our patterns have changed, we begin to seek psychological safety. We begin to seek consistency. So the principle, what that means in change, this will actually be one of the best opportunities you ever have to seek out new ways of your church's culture, new ways of being, new ways of what it is to be the church together. So I'll land the plane here before I pass it to Brad. I want to invite one more question for you to chat in. I'm wondering, what is a major hope or dream that you've had over the past year that has not yet happened? Okay, a major ministry hope or dream from the past year that hasn't happened yet. Something you've wanted to see take place. Sue, connecting through family activity out in one local area while out daily walking rather than just offering online participation. Yeah, so connecting people in that way. How about others? What's a hope or dream that you've had in your ministry that just hasn't happened yet? And I will set Brad up as we're waiting for some chat to come in. We think the key that is going to help you get there, the way that you prepare for those changes, the best thing that you can be doing in this season is actually listening to those inside your church, listening to those in your neighborhood community. Now we've got some chat coming in. Intergenerational, growth in corporate prayer, young people taking on ownership, the church growing numerically, fresh expression of church to connect with the unchurched. Yeah, we've got some awesome responses coming in here. I want to invite you to hold on to those dreams. We're going to take you into those dreams as we get into the cohort. But we think the most important work for you to do to prepare for that is being in touch deeply with those people inside and outside your church. So Brad, can you take us into the listening work?
Yeah. And Jake, you're going to share slides here.
Yeah, we'll do that right now.
Thank you. So a lot of you have indicated in your ideas about what's changed and what you've been up to, about how much you're reaching out and how much listening you're doing, which is so encouraging. So, this question that's often in front of us and that's now in front of us even more than ever in the face of a rapidly changing and at times confusing culture and moment, how can churches respond? And we believe that the most important thing that we can do is listen, as Jake said. And we want to actually share another quote with you from Scott Cormode, with whom you'll interact during this process. And one of Scott's leadership maxims is leadership begins with listening. Leadership doesn't begin with our own vision. It doesn't begin with our power. It doesn't begin with directing people. It begins with listening to our people, with the people who God has entrusted to our care. And there are a lot of ways to do that. We'll give you some different ways of doing that through this process, including as we get into the cohort, we'll be doing a church assessment and really give you a chance to learn. Lisa was talking just a little bit ago about the strengths of their church and how they could kind of start on their strengths and build with there. One way they got there was through really listening to their people and listening through the assessment in particular. But before we do that, we want to start with empathy. We want to start with empathy. Empathy we define as feeling with others, feeling with young people in particular, as being willing to sit on the curb of their lives and listen to their stories, listen to their experiences, and not judging. Withholding judgment is one of the most important pieces of this. And we want to frame empathy, listening in empathy, because it will help us move beyond labels and cultural, generational labels are some of the worst labels that we hold, right? And some of us on this call have experienced that in various ways from other generations. But empathy moves us beyond labels. Brene Brown, who has studied empathy and vulnerability a lot here in the US context, and her work has spread around the world, she says empathy fuels connection, as opposed to sympathy, which drives disconnection. So sympathy can hold people at a distance. It can be sort of like pitying young people, or again, judging them across generations, feeling sorry for them. That's not what we're talking about. We're actually talking about listening in a way that creates empathy, that creates connection and warmth, which helps us move forward. So Jake's going to give you a few tips for listening between now and when the cohort really kicks off in the fall.
Yeah, so we certainly want to give you research, we want to give you ideas, but we really want it to be grounded in something practical. So you're going to notice these tips correspond with the handout that we gave you that Brad talked about. The handout has the Growing Young wheel on one side, but then it has team discussion questions on the second side. So here's the tips for listening that correspond with those questions. First, we want to invite you, and really practically over the next 2 or 3 months, consider how many people you're going to try and listen to and in what format you will do so. This can be as simple as one-on-one conversations with a family member or a friend. But this could take the format of an online Zoom focus group where you get 6 teenagers that you know on the call together and decide to ask them some questions. But just make a very practical decision. Whose perspective do we need? Maybe it's someone in your community, particularly some young people in the community outside of the church who you just want to strike up a conversation and ask them some good questions. Second, decide who's going to do that listening. Is it the pastor? Is it some volunteers? Could younger people in our church participate in the listening? And how are we going to capture and reflect on what we hear? Are we going to have maybe a notepad and just jot down some themes that come up? There's a lot of ways that we can do that. Number 3, choose your questions. As you choose questions, we recommend that you focus on what is positive and life-giving. So don't make your questions, what do you hate about God? What do you hate about the church? And when do you think the Church of Scotland is going to close its doors for good, right? That will send you down a particular route. We think a different route of questioning. When is a time when you've really experienced God? What do you love most about our church? When is a time where you really have experienced peace or justice, or you've seen God at work? And then the 4th step, compile your notes, have a meeting, discuss what you heard from those notes, and then act. There's a lot of ways to take this, but we would say very practically one of the best things you could do in the next few months. Let's say you don't have any young people who are part of your church, but you have some family and connections who are young people. How could you just have very natural conversations to ask them, what do they care about? What do they think about? What is their life like in this season? This is not going to be the only time that we talk about listening. This is going to come up over and over the next year. So many of us in churches are used to talking. We're not used to spending time listening. We actually want you to try out those muscles over the next few months as we get into the cohort. Brad and I have plenty more we could say, but we're interested in hearing from more of you. So Graham, I believe you're going to take us into an example, and then we'll go into our team discussion time for about 20 minutes after that. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. I'll just share with you just what happened when I came back from having been across the Neil, across at the summit in October. And the key thing I came back from that with was that sense of needing to listen. It actually came at a good time for us. I was actually beginning to really struggle because some of our families weren't connecting with us on Sundays in the way that they had been. And I was really quite lost with that. So what I did was drew together a group of folk in their 20s and early 30s in our church and said, you know, I'm lost. I went kind of cap in hand and said, I really don't know what to do here. And shared with them where we were. And they said, Graham, actually, it's not about Sunday. We don't have opportunities to share with each other outside Sundays in the way that we used to. We really need to do more of that. So we sat and talked about what we would do. We decided to do some 10-pin bowling, but 3 lanes, ended up needing 7. We had a snooker evening for some men. We did some Christmas events, and then did a Beatles drive, which was great because it engaged some of the older folk in the church as well as the younger folk in the church. So those things were things that began to move things on. And they may seem small and insignificant, but they came out of me recognizing that I didn't have the answers and I needed to listen. And actually, we did something on the back of that. That same group, some of them were on the Kirk session, and in January, we asked about suggestions about what to do, and 3 suggestions came back. One was that we should take away the railings at the front of the church. Second was that we should put a cafe in under the balcony. And the third was that we should change the time of our service because it was too late at 11 o'clock. So the Kirk session decided they weren't going to run with the first 2, but they would run with the third one. So we told the congregation we were thinking about changing the time of the service, and that put the ball up in the slates. But actually led to some really interesting discussions, because what I began to say to folk was, young folk made 3 suggestions. We've already said no to 2 of them. Are we going to say no to the third? And that conversation was really helpful because it began to open folk up to realize that actually we weren't really prioritizing young people at all. And we weren't really listening to what they said, even though we thought we were. And that has been a really important conversation for us as a church. I think we've taken that into lockdown and we began to think, well, what do we need to shape for young people? It's not just about what we shape for other people. So that key thing for us about listening, and it's not just been about me as a minister, so I think that question about, so you're going to say no, 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 is actually how are we as a church listening to younger people? So these things have been absolutely key and absolutely crucial for us.
Graham, I think that one of the things that stands out to me so much from what you shared is oftentimes listening can seem kind of passive. It can seem like, wait a second, all you're inviting us to do is listen. If we listen well, that can be costly and that can be painful in what it might lead us into. So that's part of the reason why we want you to start this process by beginning those listening muscles, trying them out, because we really think that that's going to lead us into where this process needs to go. So, Graham, unless you have anything else to add, in just a moment, we're going to send people to breakout groups. Does that work?
Yep.
So in your breakout groups, which are your church teams, we would invite you to, again, focus on those questions, the team discussion questions from the handout. Feel free to message probably Graham if you don't have that, and Graham can make sure that you get it, or I think he's going to put it in the chat here to download. He did once already. When you come back from your team discussion, we're going to ask one person from your team to chat in and summarize a key insight. Okay, so be ready for one person to summarize one of your key insights, and then we're going to have plenty of time for you to ask questions when we come back. So about 20 minutes in your teams, and when you come back, we'll ask you to summarize in the chat and then have time for questions. Brad or Graham, anything you want to add before we go into our breakout rooms?
No, just go for it.
All right, the breakout rooms have been opened. You may need to click on breakout room on the bottom and accept it to go to your room.